Hi, welcome to the Aftermath Tales. Ready for a new story? Very well, let's begin.
The wedding dress hung like a ghost in my childhood bedroom, delicate ivory silk that had weathered years in tissue paper, waiting for this moment. My mother's dress. The one Wendy had tried to throw away 3 times before I finally rescued it and moved out. "Over my dead body, will you wear that ratty old thing to your wedding?" Wendy had hissed through the phone just an hour ago, her voice dripping with that familiar venom. What will people think? What will they say about our family? Our family. The words made my stomach churn. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, pacing the small apartment I shared with Damien. "It's my wedding, Wendy. My choice. Your father won't stand for this disrespect, Vera. You know he won't." And there it was, the threat she'd been wielding for years like a sword over my head. Dad would choose her. He always chose her. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my mother's dress with tears burning my eyes. Some battles, I'd learned, you fight even when you know you'll lose. Hi, I'm Vera Thompson, and I'm 26 years old, with a backbone my stepmother has been trying to break for the better part of a decade. I'm a freelance accountant, good with numbers, terrible with family politics, and apparently cursed with the ability to love people who don't love me back. My fiancé Damien works in sales for Meridian Pharmaceuticals, and he's the kind of man who brings me coffee in bed and doesn't flinch when I cry about my family drama for the 100th time. He proposed 6 months ago in my grandparents' garden, the same spot where my real mother and father had gotten married 28 years ago, back when love felt simple and uncomplicated. The problem, well, problems plural, started the day after we announced our engagement. Wendy Thompson, my stepmother and professional victim, had immediately launched into wedding planner mode. Not because she cared about my happiness, but because she saw an opportunity to control something. To be the center of attention at someone else's event. She'd married my father when I was 13, 2 years after my mother Sarah died of cancer, and she'd spent every day since then trying to erase any trace of the woman who came before her. A backyard wedding? Wendy had laughed when I'd told her our plans. The sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Vera, honey, you can't be serious. The Riverside Grand Hotel has a beautiful ballroom. Think of the pictures. Think of what people will say." But I didn't want the Riverside Grand Hotel. I wanted my grandparents' garden, where the roses my grandmother Mary had planted still bloomed every spring, where my parents had danced their first dance as husband and wife under twinkling lights strung between oak trees. I wanted to honor my mother's memory, not hide from it. That's when Wendy played her trump card, my father. Leo Thompson was a good man who had become a coward. Grief had broken something in him when Mom died, and instead of healing, he'd let Wendy fill the cracks with her poison. He loved me, I knew he did, but he loved his peace more. It was easier to give Wendy what she wanted than to fight her tears, her tantrums, her carefully orchestrated emotional manipulations. "Your stepmother just wants to be included," he'd said yesterday when I'd called to tell him about the dress situation. His voice carried that familiar note of exhaustion, the sound of a man who'd stopped fighting years ago. "Maybe you could compromise? Wear Wendy's dress? Have the wedding at the hotel?" "Wendy's dress?" The words came out strangled. "Dad, she's been married twice before. Which dress are we talking about here?" Silence stretched across the phone line. "I have Mom's dress," I'd continued, my voice breaking. "The dress you picked out together, the one she wore when she promised to love you forever. Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore?" "Vera," he'd started, but I'd already heard everything I needed to hear in that silence. Now I sat in my kitchen, staring at the wedding invitations Damien and I had designed together. Simple cardstock with elegant script announcing our ceremony in the Thompson family garden. 50 invitations that might as well have been 50 tiny declarations of war. My phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother Mary. "Sweetie, the roses are starting to bloom early this year. The garden will be perfect for your special day." Another buzz, this one from Wendy. "I hope you're proud of yourself. Your father is heartbroken that you won't even consider what makes us happy." I turned the phone face down and picked up my mother's dress again, holding it against my chest. The silk still smelled faintly of her perfume, white shoulders, the same fragrance I wore on special occasions. Some problems, I realize, don't have solutions. They just have consequences. And sometimes you have to decide what you can live with. "We need to meet," Dad's voice came through the phone, stiff and formal. "All of us, including Damien's parents." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "What?" "Dinner this Saturday night. 7 o'clock at Romano's. We're going to settle this wedding business once and for all." Romano's, the upscale Italian place downtown where Dad took clients when he wanted to impress them. Neutral territory, he probably thought. A place where people would be forced to behave. "Dad, I don't think." "Have Damien call his parents to coordinate. This gives everyone time to arrange their schedules." The line went dead, leaving me staring at Damien, who was getting ready for work at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. "Your dad wants to have dinner with my parents?" he asked, straightening his tie. "This Saturday?" "Apparently." A wild idea struck me. "You know what? Fine. But I'm calling Grandma and Grandpa. If he wants to make this a family affair, let's make it a real family affair." Damien paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Vera, are you sure that's wise?" I was already dialing. "Grandma, it's me. Are you and Grandpa free for dinner this Saturday night?" Romano's was bustling with the usual Saturday evening crowd. I'd called to add 2 seats to Dad's reservation, claiming he'd asked me to include my grandparents. The hostess had been happy to accommodate. Dad had requested the private dining room in the back. Of course he had. Nothing like the illusion of intimacy to force people to play nice. Damien and I arrived first, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. I'd worn the blue dress Mom always said brought out my eyes, like armor against whatever was coming. Dad and Wendy arrived next, Wendy resplendent in a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than my rent. She air-kissed my cheek, her perfume overwhelming in the small space. "Vera, darling, you look lovely, though that blue is a bit bold for a restaurant, don't you think?" Before I could respond, 2 figures appeared in the doorway. The man was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and an expensive suit that spoke of success. The woman beside him was breathtaking in the way that old money and perfect breeding produced. Understated diamonds, a Chanel dress that probably cost more than my car, and the kind of effortless elegance that couldn't be bought or faked. "You must be Leo," the man said, extending his hand to my father. "Jeff Smith, and this is my wife, Eve." Dad shook hands, clearly impressed despite himself. "Leo Thompson, thank you so much for coming, and this is my wife, Wendy." Wendy had just taken a sip of wine when she turned to greet them. The choking fit was spectacular. Wine sprayed across the white tablecloth as Wendy gasped and sputtered, her face cycling through several alarming shades of red and purple. Dad immediately jumped up, patting her back while shooting apologetic looks at our guests. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Something must have gone down the wrong way." "Hello, Wendy," Eve said, her voice carrying the kind of Arctic politeness that could freeze hell itself. Her smile was perfect, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying. "How unexpected to see you here." The tension was suffocating. Jeff had gone completely rigid, his jaw clenched so tight I was surprised it didn't crack. But Eve looked like a queen surveying a peasant who dared to speak out of turn. "Well, isn't this cozy?" came Grandpa Louie's voice from the doorway. My heart soared. My grandparents stood there like avenging angels. Grandpa distinguished in his navy suit, Grandma Mary radiant in lavender silk, both of them looking like they owned the world. Dad's face went through several interesting color changes. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" "Vera invited us," Grandma said sweetly, moving to embrace me. "We wouldn't miss meeting Damien's lovely parents." The seating arrangement became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Wendy found herself wedged between Dad and Jeff, with Eve directly across from her and my grandparents flanking me like bodyguards. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "Well, I thought we should all get together to discuss the wedding plans. Make sure we're all on the same page." "Of course," Wendy said, her confidence returning now that she was on familiar ground. "The Riverside Grand Hotel has the most beautiful ballroom, very elegant, very sophisticated, much more appropriate than a backyard." She waved a dismissive hand. "And that dress, Vera, I know you think it's sentimental, but it's so outdated, yellowed with age. People will think we're poor, or worse, that we have no taste." She delivered her masterstroke with a bright smile. You know, I have a beautiful wedding dress you could wear instead. Pure white silk, barely worn, very elegant. Which one, you ask? Well, I have several to choose from. The silence that followed wasn't just arctic, it was apocalyptic. Jeff's fork clattered to his plate. Grandpa Louie's knuckles turned white where he gripped his wineglass. Even Damien looked like he'd been slapped. But it was Eve who broke the silence, setting down her wineglass with deliberate precision. "Vera," she said, her tone warm when addressing me, with underlying steel that made Wendy flinch. "What do you want? This is your wedding, darling. Follow your heart." I could see Wendy calculating behind her eyes, trying to figure out how to regain control. But Eve wasn't finished. "You know," Eve continued, swirling her wine with casual elegance, "I find that the most beautiful weddings are always the ones that honor family traditions. There's something so authentic about wearing a dress with history, with love woven into every thread." Her gaze flicked to Wendy with surgical precision. "So much more meaningful than something new and untested, don't you think?" "But people will talk," Wendy protested, her voice rising. "They'll wonder why we couldn't afford a proper venue, and that dress is so outdated, so yellowed." "How very pedestrian," Eve interrupted smoothly, and the word landed like a slap. "To be so concerned with what strangers might think rather than what actually matters to the bride." Jeff was staring at his plate, clearly recognizing his wife's particular brand of elegant warfare. Dad looked confused, sensing undercurrents he couldn't identify. Wendy's face flushed red. "I am her mother," she cried, tears starting to flow. "I've tried for 13 years to be a good mother to this ungrateful girl, and this is how I'm treated, like some kind of monster." The restaurant was starting to stare as her voice rose to that familiar pitch, but Grandpa Louie stood up slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury I'd never seen before. "A good mother?" His voice was quiet but cut through her sobs like a knife. "You want to know why we treat you like a monster, Wendy? Because that's exactly what you are." "Dad, please," my father started, but Grandpa held up a hand. "We sat by our daughter-in-law's hospital bed for 3 days, Leo. 3 days watching Sarah cry for you, asking where you were, begging us to call you." His voice shook with 15 years of suppressed rage. "We called and called. Your phone just rang and rang." Dad went very still, his face cycling through realization and horror. He'd heard this before, but seeing his parents' raw pain he dismissed and ignored 15 years ago, was finally hitting him. "When exactly did Sarah pass away?" Eve asked with sharp curiosity. "March 15th, 2010, Grandma whispered. Eve's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, her eyes widening. "March 2010. She turned to stare at Wendy with newfound fascination. "How industrious of you, darling. That's exactly when you were telling Jeff how much you needed him, how alone you were." "Both of them?" Grandpa's voice was strangled. "You were with Jeff too?" Eve's smile turned absolutely predatory. "Oh, yes. What a busy little month that must have been for you, Wendy." Jeff's face went from confusion to sick realization. Dad looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "She knew," Grandpa said with devastating finality, his voice breaking. "Wendy heard us crying, begging you to come say goodbye to your wife, and she hung up on us because keeping you in her bed was more important than letting a dying woman see her husband one last time." I felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs. Did my mother die of cancer and heartbreak? The silence was devastating. "Yes," Grandpa said simply. "She knew what your father was doing, and it broke what was left of her heart." "It wasn't like that." Wendy whispered desperately. "I loved him, I was just trying to—" "Oh, please," Eve interjected with delighted cruelty. "Let me guess, you were comforting him? How noble. Tell me, Wendy, was my husband better at playing the grieving friend, or were you getting the same sob story from both of them?" The color drained from Jeff's face. Dad's mouth fell open. Eve's smile was absolutely radiant. "Oh yes, she was quite the busy little bee 15 years ago, though I suppose when one affair didn't pan out the way she hoped." She glanced meaningfully at Jeff, who looked ready to disappear into his chair. She had to settle for whichever man was stupid enough to actually marry her. Grandma Mary's voice cut through the chaos, thick with tears and rage. "Sarah loved you deeply, Leo, and was willing to forgive you. We are ashamed that you are our son. We never thought you would be that cruel. And until now, you're still willing to give in to Wendy's stupid tantrums over your own child. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The restaurant seemed to tilt around me. My father, who I'd seen as weak but never evil, had cheated on my dying mother. And she'd known. She'd died knowing she'd been betrayed. "I think we've heard quite enough," Eve said, standing with fluid grace. "Vera, darling, let's discuss your wedding flowers instead. Something much more pleasant." As we gathered our things to leave, I looked at Dad, who sat in stunned silence, and Wendy, whose mask had finally completely slipped. "I'm wearing my mother's dress," I said quietly, "in my grandparents' garden. And you," I looked directly at Wendy, "are not invited." Some secrets, I realized, don't just change everything when they come out. They obliterate it. 3 months later, I stood in my childhood bedroom at my grandparents' house, smoothing the ivory silk of my mother's wedding dress. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years just for me. Grandma Mary fastened the tiny pearl buttons along my spine, her fingers gentle and sure. "You look just like her," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "Sarah would be so proud." Through the window, I could see the garden below, roses in full bloom just as Grandma had promised, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, and Damien standing at the makeshift altar with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. His parents were in the front row, Eve resplendent in champagne silk and looking every inch the proud mother-in-law. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Grandpa appeared in the doorway, distinguished in his navy suit, offering me his arm. I nodded, though my heart was heavy with everything I'd learned that night at Romano's. The image of my mother dying alone, calling for a husband who chose his mistress over her bedside, would haunt me forever. But today wasn't about that pain. Today was about choosing love over bitterness, hope over heartbreak. We made our way downstairs and through the house that had become my sanctuary. The back door opened to reveal my wedding. Intimate, beautiful, and exactly what I'd dreamed of. The Thompson aunties sat in the second row, looking elegant and formidable. My cousins filled the next few rows, all of them beaming at me with genuine joy. And then I saw him. Dad, sitting awkwardly near the back, alone. His face was gaunt, aged years in just 3 months. Our eyes met, and I saw the weight of his guilt, his regret, his desperate hope for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. He should have been the one walking me down this aisle. In another life, in a world where he'd made different choices, it would have been his arm I took, his tears of joy at seeing his daughter as a bride. Instead, he sat in the back like any other guest, watching his own father fulfill the role he'd forfeited through his betrayals. The music began, and Grandpa squeezed my arm as we started down the aisle. Every step felt like triumph, not just marrying the man I loved, but doing it surrounded by people who truly cared about me, in a place that honored my mother's memory. I was halfway to the altar when I heard the commotion behind me. Wendy had arrived, uninvited, but had the audacity to show up. She stood at the garden gate in a cream-colored dress that was entirely too formal and entirely too inappropriate, her chin lifted in that familiar, defiant way. For a moment, she looked like she might march right down the aisle and cause the scene of all scenes. Dad shot up from his seat in the back, his face cycling through shock and fury. "Wendy, no! Get out, now!" Wendy was going to say something, but then she saw them. Eve turned first, her expression shifting from warm mother-in-law smile to Arctic elegance in the space of a heartbeat. "Wendy," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. "What an unexpected surprise. I wasn't aware uninvited guests were part of the ceremony." The Thompson aunties turned next, moving with the coordinated precision of a pack of hunting wolves. Aunt Margaret raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Aunt Ruth smiled the kind of smile that had made grown men apologize for breathing too loudly. Aunt Patricia simply cracked her knuckles. My cousins shifted in their seats, all of them turning to face Wendy with expressions that ranged from barely contained hostility to outright anticipation. These were people who had watched their family's golden boy destroy his dying wife's final days. They had been waiting years for this moment. Wendy's bravado crumbled. Her eyes darted from face to hostile face, realizing she wasn't just facing one disapproving person. She was facing an entire family who despised everything she represented. There would be no sympathy here, no allies, no one to rush to her defense if she tried to make a scene. Dad was embarrassed. Perhaps, Eve continued with deadly politeness, you should reconsider disrupting such a beautiful ceremony. I'm sure everyone here would have such interesting stories to share if given the opportunity. The threat was clear. Create drama, and every ugly truth would be aired in front of everyone. Wendy would be torn apart by people who actually had power, class, and the moral high ground. I watched from the aisle, my arm still linked with Grandpa's, and smiled. For the first time in 15 years, Wendy Thompson had no power over my happiness. She turned and walked away. The ceremony continued, and it was perfect. Damien's eyes never left mine as we exchanged vows under the oak trees where my parents had once promised to love each other forever. This time I believed in the promises being made. During the reception, Dad approached me while I was talking to some cousins. The conversation died when he appeared, everyone suddenly finding their drinks very interesting. "Vera," he said quietly, "could we talk?" I excused myself and walked a few steps away with him, though I could feel protective eyes following our every move. "I know I have no right to ask," he began, his voice shaking, "but I need you to know how sorry I am, not just to you, but to Damien, to your mother's memory. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but—" "You're right," I said quietly. "It doesn't fix anything. Mom died calling your name while you were with another woman. She spent her final months knowing she'd been betrayed. That's not something I can just forgive because you finally feel guilty about it." His face crumpled. "I know. I love you, Vera. You're my daughter, and I love you too, Dad. I love you so much, but love and forgiveness aren't the same thing. Maybe someday I can forgive you, but not today. Not yet. What you did to Mom, what you let Wendy do to our family, it's going to take time." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand. I'll wait, however long it takes." We shared one dance, the only father-daughter moment he would get at my wedding. His hand shook as he held mine, and I could feel the weight of everything he'd lost in the stiffness between us. When the song ended, he kissed my forehead gently and walked away, unable to bear watching the joy he'd nearly destroyed with his selfishness. Leo Thompson walked to his car with heavy steps, the sound of his daughter's wedding celebration fading behind him. He danced with Vera one last time, felt her stiffen in his arms when he whispered his apologies, seen the pain he'd caused reflected in eyes that used to look at him with nothing but love. 3 months had passed since that dinner at Romano's had crystallized Leo's resolve. Learning that Wendy had been playing two men while his wife died had been the final piece of a puzzle he'd been too blind to see. "Leo! Leo, wait!" He turned to see Wendy hurrying across the parking area, her cream dress catching on the gravel. "Where are you going?" she demanded, slightly out of breath. "You're just going to leave, without saying anything to me? I can't do this anymore, Wendy." His voice was hollow, emptied of everything except exhaustion. "I can't pretend we're happy. I can't pretend what we did was forgivable." "What we did?" Her voice rose to that familiar pitch that usually made him cave immediately. "I didn't do anything wrong. I fell in love with a married man, yes, but I'm not the one who made vows to someone else. I betrayed my dying wife for you. We both know what we were doing. She was already dying. I gave you comfort when she couldn't." Wendy's mask was slipping, revealing something ugly underneath. "I made you feel alive again." Leo stared at his wife of 13 years, really seeing her for the first time. "You made me feel alive while Sarah was calling my name from her hospital bed, while she was asking the nurses if I was coming, while she was dying believing I didn't love her enough to be there." "Oh, please." Wendy rolled her eyes, a gesture so callous it made Leo step backward. "She was going to die anyway. At least this way you weren't miserable watching it happen. She was my wife, the mother of my child. I should have been there." "Well, you weren't," Wendy snapped, her composure completely gone now. "And you know what? I'm glad. When your precious parents called, crying about how Sarah was asking for you, I told them you were sleeping because I knew you'd go running to her like some pathetic puppy. She was nothing but a burden, a dying woman who couldn't give you what you needed. I'm glad she died without you there because she didn't deserve." The slap echoed across the parking lot. Leo stood there, his hands still raised, staring at the woman he'd destroyed his family for. The woman who had just called his beloved first wife, the mother of his child, undeserving of love in her final moments. Wendy's hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. In 13 years of marriage, he'd never raised his hand to her, never raised his voice, never stood up to her manipulations. "Don't you ever," his voice was deadly quiet, "speak about Sarah that way again. She was worth 10 of you, and I was too blind and selfish to see it." Leo pulled his car keys from his pocket. "I want a divorce, Wendy. I want you out of my house, out of my life. And if you ever come near my daughter again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are." "You can't divorce me." The tears came then, real ones born of panic rather than manipulation. "I'm your wife. I gave you years of my life." "You gave me years of hell," Leo said quietly. "You made me betray the woman I really loved. You drove my daughter away. You cost me my parents. And for what?" He got in his car and started the engine. Through the windshield, he could see Wendy standing there in her inappropriate cream dress, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding that her victim act wasn't going to work anymore. As he drove away, Leo caught a glimpse of her in his rearview mirror, collapsing to her knees in the gravel, sobbing like the broken woman she actually was, instead of the victim she pretended to be. But his pity had run out 15 years too late. Sarah's face, dying alone, calling his name, would torment him forever. Wendy knelt in the dirt, her expensive dress ruined, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears. For the first time in her life, her manipulations had failed completely. "Well, well." The voice was crisp and absolutely merciless. Wendy looked up to see Aunt Margaret standing over her, with Aunt Ruth beside her. Both women looked ready for war. "I do believe you were asked to leave," Margaret said coolly. "Now," Ruth added, cracking her knuckles, "you're going to get up, walk to your car, and disappear from our family's lives forever. Or we'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what you are." Wendy stumbled to her feet and ran toward the road without another word, her heels catching in the gravel with every desperate step. Margaret and Ruth watched her go with satisfaction before returning to the wedding reception, where their great-niece was finally free. 2 years later, I received a copy of a divorce decree in the mail. Dad had finally found the courage to leave Wendy, though it took him long enough. The papers were accompanied by a letter explaining that he was in therapy, that he knew he could never undo the damage he'd caused, but that he hoped someday we might find our way back to each other. I still wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but I had started taking his calls. Baby steps towards something that might eventually look like a relationship. Wendy had moved back to whatever hole she'd crawled out of, alone and forgotten. Eve had made sure she was persona non grata in every social circle that mattered. The aunties had done the rest. Damien and I were happy. Blissfully, completely happy, living in a house with a garden where I grew roses in memory of my mother. Every May, on our anniversary, I picked a bouquet and told her about the year that had passed, about the love that had finally won. Some stories end with forgiveness and redemption. Others end with the simple triumph of refusing to let the people who hurt you steal your joy. I chose joy. Every single day.
If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Don't forget to follow for more content just like this. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.